So in other words, that person who was at $3 or who was $3 below, now they might only be $1 below. We do assume that that person who was at $12.50 is probably still getting some bump up in their pay because lower paid workers are getting a raise. But we assume that that increase is not going to be quite as large as what the folks at the absolute bottom are getting. So there's still some distance between them, but it's probably shrunk.
I understand. So I think that might affect one's assumption about an operating cost for a firm. If that firm intuitively wants to maintain that $3 delta between employee A and B, or 1 and 2 is my first example. So just curious about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a series of about 4 questions to ask about this report. One of them is something that appears important to this population, working poor or people, residents in Minneapolis that live in poverty. In your simulations, in your study, have you seen a change in the ability to offer social services in these different cities that you've studied? I ask because a report I read about the state of Washington showed a significant decrease in the amount of social services that were able to be offered given minimum wage laws.
First, to answer that question, one component of the analysis that Dr. Rogers produced for us, and again, he cannot be here today, but one component of the food security analysis that he simulated was reliance on social services, programs like a reduced price lunch, like SNAP, like EITC, and the simulation that he ran accounted for the cutoffs and design of the state of Minnesota. So the simulation does account for eligibility rates within the state.
Thank you. The second is about cost of living changes. I understand that I'm less concerned about restaurants' prices increasing than I am that if most of the minimum wage increase, or 51%, as you said in your piece, are passed along to consumers, 2 of my concerns are how many of these workers live in the city? It sounds like in response to someone else's question, you said about half, but that's a really important point. So is it half, or can you point me to which appendix that information is in?
Appendix B.
B, thank you. And then how many, does this modest increase begin to make up for the increase in total living expenses based on your study? You talk about the increase in take-home pay, but when you look at all of the things, not just restaurants and healthcare, not just these 3 services, but does that amount of increase begin to make up for the increase in total cost of living?
Is this, again, with response to the family budget price sensitivity analysis that was ran?
Yes.
So to be clear, all of these simulations, they assume price inflation baked in. So in other words, these are real changes in income. So this is after accounting for adjusted in prices, anticipated increases in prices over the next 5 years. What is the real change in folks' income? So yes, that is baked into the model. At the same time, the increase in costs that we talk about for restaurants and other highly impacted industries, those increases are just industry specific. In terms of the effect on overall prices, most studies show that you wouldn't see any significant inflationary pressure for goods as a whole resulting from an increase in the minimum wage. And so we assume the Congressional Budget Office's projections for inflation as an underlying component of this entire analysis.
Okay. I ask because we have a disproportionate amount of low-income housing in Minneapolis, specific to our region as a whole. So to affect as many people living in Minneapolis in poverty, not in a negative way with a cost of living increase, that's kind of where I'm going with these questions. The third question is, it says in your slides, and you mentioned there's no competitive pressure. What do you mean by that? And did you look at it, because some things you look at based on a city minimum wage and a county minimum wage? A big concern I have here is, are we big enough to be an island? And if somebody's looking for a restaurant experience downtown or a lunch on Eat Street, that's hard to replicate, but there are innumerable small businesses across our city that would face the pressure, especially as you get closer to the edges of our city, where to me a county model seems to make more sense, but I'm not the expert here. So could you comment on that?
Right. So first, specifically, the price sensitivity analysis that was referred to was a county level, local level analysis. The comment on competition was to more highlight, I guess, some of the thought process behind what this change in price is supposed to represent. Given that there is a reduction in turnover, given that there's a reduction in the costs that are associated with turnover, one might ask, if one's willing to save $2,000, as that one study suggested, why don't they do it? And part of the answer is that businesses are concerned with keeping up with each other. So that was a comment that was meant to say that the reason, the motivation behind why firms may not be offering higher wages unilaterally without the policy implication is that they feel like they are competing with each other. And with a policy-wide increase in the minimum wage, that would not be the case. There have been instances, however, there have been local retail establishments, Costco's and whatnot, that have increased their wages for their workers without being forced to, and they saw a reduction in turnover, and they saw some of those cost savings. So that was the intent of that comment.
Thank you. My last question is in part in response to Councilmember Bender. Pardon me, your response to Councilmember Bender's question is, if these three industries that you mentioned in your report still need people regardless, what about the others that don't, again, where people are more likely to be replaced, particularly the risk of getting their hours cut in these other industries? Can you comment on that a little bit more than you have?
Sure. So the reason why the literature that we use focuses mainly on retail and restaurant industries, because that's where the largest effects would be seen. Given that there are the entire product that these firms are producing is based off of their staffing, that means all of what they're trying to offer is in some way tied to the minimum wage. Whereas, as Councilwoman Bender noted, goods that are tangible and produced are able to be shipped and moved around. In terms as to why these studies focus again on these industries, it's because these not only are industries that where the most amount of discussion revolves around, because that's where the most amount of change would be occurring, but it's also as part of an identifiability strategy to say that if we're going to be looking at changes in the minimum wage, let's look at industries who are going to be very reactive to the minimum wage, and let's use them for our baseline scenario. So rather than going into industries that have relatively low usage of the minimum wage, what lessons can we learn from the industries that do have a high sensitivity to changes in the minimum wage? So when we produce our estimates for the restaurant and retail industry, that should be seen as estimates that are based off of industries that would be most sensitive to the changes in the minimum wage. And that's why the literature tends to focus on those industries.
Thank you.
So we have 3 more council members in queue. I think I'm going to just kind of call the questions after that, because we have one more presentation from staff and then we need to conclude our meeting. I'll just say I myself have held my questions because I wanted to allow our colleagues to ask. I'm sure that people have many more questions, so maybe we'll have to talk to Mr. Frank about how to continue if there are additional questions. Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And actually, your information about how inflation is adjusted for in the base or what we call, consumer prices are adjusted in the base is very helpful. And that was one of the questions I had. The other question kind of goes to what you're saying too about what industries we'll look at. And I'm looking at this. It's not the slide that's in front of us now, but it's the food insecurity slide that you had. And one of the industries that I see being affected by a change in the minimum wage is actually the grocery industry, and they operate on a 1% margin. If memory serves me, I worked in grocery stores as a young person, and I am concerned about sort of the potential gallop that you might see in costs that are going to continue to go up as time goes on if we have a increase in the minimum wage, really affecting people who are the most at risk for just the basic buying their food at the grocery store. And grocery stores employ a lot. They operate on a very small margin. Then they also employ people, not everyone obviously, but a lot of people, beggars, people that work in maintenance at the grocery stores are probably below $12 and $15 an hour. So that was the thing that hit me about, I think the concern for what this could do to stepping up that overall price increase that we would see normally if that would overall increase that is what I'm concerned about. I mean, you don't need to respond. It's just my head.
One comment that I would say, again, because Dr. Rogers is not here, is he does look at the average expenditure of a family on grocery-specific food, not just food, plus restaurant food, plus fast food.
Most poor families don't eat at restaurants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he finds that there is an increase in grocery expenditures after the change of the minimum wage.
Okay, thank you. Is that someplace in the report?
Yes, it would be in. It'd be at the end of the report. It would be somewhere in the 200s, page 200.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two more questions. The first is I didn't totally understand the back and forth about the issue of tipped workers, and I wondered if you could define a tip credit and just help us understand how those are tracked by places that have different statuses for tipped workers and not. And then I'll just tell you my second question, because that one is kind of a big one that I think you could probably summarize succinctly. I wondered if you could compare the $12 versus $15 amount in terms of the impact on prices in these key industries, as well as on job growth, just since that was one of the big questions I think this study was intended to answer.
Sure. So again, I guess first speaking to your question on policy design, there are some localities that have sliced the minimum wage into many different kinds of tiers. One, as you mentioned, was for tipped workers. Minnesota does not, however, have a special tier for tipped workers. We require that any minimum wage be paid to workers regardless of whether or not they earn tips. And the basis for our price sensitivity study is in California, which, as David mentioned earlier, has a similar comparable law.
So I think Councilmember Fry mentioned something about the 1099 tracking of that, and that's the part I didn't understand about how jurisdictions track who's a tipped worker or not and what wages they're making and not.
So there's in localities that have a tip credit, what that essentially means is that the way the law is defined is, I'll give you the federal law as an example. Under federal law, if a worker makes at least $35 per month in tips, their employer may take a credit that reduces the wage that they pay to that employee down to only $2.13 per hour, provided that whatever they make in tips over the course of 1 week averages out to an hourly rate that is at least the regular minimum wage. So basically, they're supposed to record what all the tips were, both in cash and credit cards, and then at the end of the week, do a calculation as to whether dividing that by hours plus that $2.13 gets them up to the regular minimum wage, and if not, they're supposed to top them off and pay more than $2.13 to get them up to regular minimum wage. It's entirely on the business to make that determination. And actually, you raise a good point. It's very hard to enforce because if they're not topping the employee off, the onus is on the employee to then go to the employer and say, you haven't paid me enough for this week. And so enforcement is a challenge.
And it's handled basically every pay period or weekly. Every pay period.
It's calculated at a weekly basis.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
One also quick note, there are many localities that we looked at in the study that design credits based off of other factors. Like, for example, if the workplace provides childcare or healthcare benefits, there are some places that have a similar credit.
Then there was that second question about the $12 and $15 rates and the differences in those wages on prices and job growth.
Sure. So, let's see. The way that we came to the numbers that I showed, where the increase in the cost of a meal that would cost $25 without the minimum wage, how much would it change if you implemented the minimum wage? And both changes were less than $2. And the way that we came to that number is, again, controlling for inflation, controlling for changes that happened within the county at that time. We used that sensitivity estimate to then say, given these two minimum wages that we've simulated, again, one being 5 small increases yearly until we reach 12, one being 5 small increases until we reach 15. That's how we arrived at those numbers. So when I mentioned 166 earlier, that would come down from the bottom of the Appendix H slide. So 25 minus 2666. That's where that number comes from for $15, and then comparably for 12.
Councilmember Warsame.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank the research team for their compelling study. I took it for holiday, and I'm still kind of confused with it, but thank you very much. And what I wanted to ask was, in terms of the jurisdictions that you looked at and other municipalities and the county in San Jose, what was the results in terms of low-income workers and people of color and the impact that increasing the minimum wage had on small businesses? Somebody can talk about that.
Would you like to?
Yeah, the San Jose case or a similar jurisdiction that you looked at. Just pick one, yeah.
So the San Jose study that we looked at specifically is just measuring price effects. So in that study, they weren't looking at, they did actually look at employment effects and found similar results to what we've reported here, that there were no significant changes in employment. But I don't believe they go into detail about effects on particular communities, such as communities of color. There have been other studies that have looked at impacts on communities of color, and because communities of color tend to have workers that are paid lower wages than their white counterparts, they tend to be more heavily impacted by increases in the minimum wage. Most of those studies, again, are all looking, when you talk about what happens to employment, they're all looking for average effects. So they're not necessarily looking at what the effects were for a specific racial or ethnic group. They're talking about, on average, what was the change in employment. So I don't know that there really has been great work looking at just the impacts were on particular communities within a local economy.
What about low-income workers in terms of, the people that would be affected by the increase? Has it had a beneficial increase?
I'll pass over to my colleague here.
Okay.
Well, we didn't. My specialty was on immigrant workers, and part of the analysis, given that the size of the population is not big enough, this is more on the national aspect of the analysis. And in the simulated 12 and 15, low-skilled workers, immigrants. So this is within the immigrant population, immigrant workers were the most impacted in terms of earnings, the low wages, low earnings, and no significant effect on employment. If they find, as you can see, well, this is 160 page on the report, but and then we have, it doesn't appear, but appendix K and L are related to table 50 on page 160 of the report. If there any employment, what I found out in my results was positive impact on particular groups of immigrants, which are non-Hispanic white immigrants. But across all the group, the earnings or low wage impact was positive on within, again, immigrant workers. That's a specific or a specific group, but this is a national analysis, so it's not specific to the state of Minnesota.
on average, Minnesota is no different in significant terms to these average numbers. If I explain myself.
That's a good point. And in terms of, I'm kind of confused with the tip workers and how this the discussion that we've been having. If you increase it for all the restaurant workers, the tip earners earn more money than the back end workers. How would that impact the restaurant itself, or the bottom line of the restaurant?
Well, it would be no different than the current situation. Anytime under Minnesota state law, the minimum wage goes up. It's indexed to inflation rate, so it goes up automatically each year right now. So it would be no different. It would just be a larger increase. This is the same way it operates in seven other states that have no lower minimum wage for tipped workers. When the minimum wage goes up, tipped workers, because they're being tipped, do probably see a larger increase in their earnings than folks who are just getting the minimum wage and no tips.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Councilmember Andrew Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank the project team for this work. I appreciate the analysis and these data and look forward to doing a deeper dive and reading the whole study. But I just want to say how helpful it is to have that data available and to have some information that we can actually sort through when considering these decisions.
Councilmember Frye, did you have a last quick one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do you have an analysis of the racial breakdown of individuals that work in the back of a house at a restaurant versus in the front of the house that generally earn tips?
Specifically because the techniques that we used, we're trying to look at industry level effects, and it would require both data from the employee and the employer together. And that data is not easily accessible.
Do you have a breakdown of the take-home amount of money of the back of the house versus the front of the house?
So there's just no good available data source that looks specifically at earnings within restaurants, front of the house versus back of the house for the area that we were studying.
Okay, and so the assumption that was made is that if there's a state law, or if there's a state minimum wage not accounting for tips, then there's some form of preemption. Is that the assumption that was made?
Again, we didn't assume any change in terms of tip policy from what is currently on the books for the state of Minnesota.
Right. What I'm saying is that the state policy applies to the state minimum wage.
Right. And just to break in, I think the researchers already said this. I think that is more a legal question, and these researchers
I agree with you,
yeah.
But my concern is that an assumption was made based on the law that may not, in fact, be the law. And so I think we may need to go back and look at that. So I understand that California had many municipalities and ultimately the state that enacted a specific minimum wage. Are there any other municipalities in the country that do not have an overarching state minimum wage policy that was subsequently adopted that do not account for tips? Let me ask it a different way. Are there any cities in the entire country outside of California that do not account for tips?
There are cities in other states where they do not have a lower tip minimum. So Washington State, Oregon, right. California, Minnesota, Hawaii, Nevada, all have no lower tip minimum wage. Seattle, Tacoma, Washington, both have passed higher city minimum wage levels. Again, they didn't treat their tip workers any differently than state law.
So I'm sorry, Seattle didn't?
Seattle did not. There's no tip credit in the Seattle law as far as I can recall.
That's incorrect.
Oh, okay.
I'm 100% positive about that. I guess, okay, I'll go back and look at it. Yeah.
Your recollection may be better than mine.
Okay.
Right. All right. So I think that we need to turn, because it is 10 minutes to noon, to being able to hear this overview of a related presentation on how we might move forward on engagement. So I want to say as well, tremendous thank you to the research team. We have held you here for lots of questions, so I think that you can see people were very engaged and interested, and that your report was very, very helpful to us, and so I want to say thank you for that. I as well think that we were very fortunate to get such a respected group of researchers to come and work on this for us. And this will be important foundational work to us thinking about the impacts of what we're essentially about to talk about, which is how to engage with stakeholders in the Twin Cities area to talk about a city minimum wage policy. So again, thank you very, very much. And I'm going to, just before I forget to do this, move to receive and file our presentations. All in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And so that we have time to do this, I'd like to turn now to our last and I think brief presentation, but important presentation, which is a response to the staff direction passed a couple of months ago, or maybe it was less than that, asking for the city coordinator to present an engagement plan for us to consider. Ms. Rivera-Vandermeide.
Thank you so much. My name is Maria Rivera-Vandermeide. I'm the Deputy City Coordinator, and I promise to keep you brief. I always hate going right before lunch. It's like people here. Wanted to respond to the staff direction, and we had a staff direction that was really twofold. One is directing the Office of the City Coordinator to work with stakeholders, review policies from other cities, and to really review and incorporate the results of a very extensive study. But more importantly, what brings us to the table today is, or to City Council today, is to formulate a plan for engagement. And I want to say that one of the things that we were very fortunate perhaps to have just gone through a municipal sick leave policy, because the plan for engagement that we used there in order to bring recommendations and feedback from stakeholders was really robust, and I think served us well as we move forward in this. We have met and will continue to meet with the engagement design team. This is a new cross-departmental team that is really a one-stop shopping for any department who is looking to really actively engage on a variety of fronts, and excited about that opportunity, but also really excited to have folks in the room to really give multiple perspectives to what engagement looks like. So we had some learnings as we did the sick leave engagement, and one of them was that listening sessions were really not just robust, but really insightful, and they were really helpful as we formulated our policy. So we want to continue and move forward with direct engagement and do a variety of listening sessions. And although we did 14 for the minimum sick leave or the sick leave policy, here we're planning to do 10 to 12 listening sessions really focused on cultural communities, on industry specific. As we heard from the last presentation, there are certain industries that are more affected by minimum wage than others, so we want to make sure that we give people the opportunity to really express what's happening in their particular industry, and also a variety of public meetings to give all an opportunity to come. But we also plan not just to leave it at those 10 or 12 listening sessions, but we plan to augment that by a learning that we also heard from the business community in particular as we were moving forward, which is come meet us where we're meeting already. Don't create additional meetings that we have to fit into our current schedules, but come contact us, and where we already have a meeting scheduled, meet us there and do a presentation. So we're going to be contacting, I put a list of some folks, but obviously not an exhaustive list of the people that we are hoping to communicate with. But given that we have a little bit more time for engagement, and I'll talk about a timeline in a minute or towards the end of the presentation, we've really got the opportunity to really take advantage of already scheduled meetings where the business community in particular will be, from what I understand, happy to have us come and hear from them directly what the impacts are.
So I have a question for
Sure.
you from Councilmember Bender, and I also might have a question as well on this slide.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wondered, just having seen how much staff time went into the paid sick time discussions, do we feel like we have adequate staff availability to attend these meetings and the listening sessions? And
Chair,
kind of which staff do we think will be taking the lead on those?
Chair Glidden, Councilmember Bender, at the end of the presentation, you'll see a list of staff that's already been incorporated into a work group. And we do believe that, given our experience last year with what we did, that we've got sufficient folks to move forward. We may end up hiring a facilitator. We may end up hiring one of the additional learnings was that the written summaries of those listening sessions were really productive, not just for ourselves, but perhaps for council and for the community as a whole. And that was something that the city clerk staff did. I don't believe they have that capacity now as we talked about it because there's just a lot going on. But we do value that and really want to honor that moving forward. And that may be something that we contract with and are ready to do so. So we believe that we are sufficiently staffed, and in particular, given the time frame in which we were given a staff direction, we believe we're able to have a good flow of staff component. The other additional thing, and we talked about this a little bit with staff, and we're going to be exploring, what we heard from sick leave was there were a lot of staff, particularly those who speak second languages or third languages, who would have loved to be participants in this. And so we may make a call out to volunteers as we move forward in these meetings. They will be at different times of the day, but there's a lot of people who want to lend their particular skills and talent to this, and we may be able to use them as well.
Thank you. So this was my kind of, I guess, comment/question is, so I think that engaging in these established meetings is really important, that you have a good list here. I would just note that, and this may be the nature of kind of the kinds of groups that have established meetings, is these are all business-oriented meetings, and we are going to need to think carefully about how we're able to balance that with the worker side of those industry-specific areas that we're focusing on and kind of the other ways that we're thinking about this. So maybe that is just kind of some food for thought, and to continue to get some advice on what might be those ways to balance out our sets of meetings. So,
Chair Glenn, duly noted, and I really want to make sure that we note that this is not an exhaustive list, that we have in our mind frame, that we want to make sure that we get a balanced perspective as we move forward, because it's that balanced perspective that will allow us to make a recommendation that we think is full and really takes into consideration a variety of viewpoints.
okay, thank you.
We will also try to be as transparent as possible, and that is another thing that we found successful as we did our municipal sick leave policy. And thanks to the great quick work of the engagement design team, we already have a landing page that is on the city website that is live, that already is fed into it, this presentation, the report, and so forth. We're going to make that a little easier for folks to find as we put a link to that on our very first homepage. But for now, it is Minneapolis MN/minimum wage. But we will make that easier for folks to find from the homepage. But at least that is up and running, and we've got a good path forward as we continue to populate that. We will include in that landing page a series of calendar of events and listening sessions. We will have, as I mentioned before, the summaries of those sessions, any additional reports or research that we come across in our way, or if we decide to do surveys, we will also be linking those there. So I really mention this to make sure that City Council and the public knows that we will be as transparent as possible in this process moving forward. I also want to say that we will have a link for folks to leave comments should they want to do so, written comments, and there will be an email address in which they can do that, and staff will be able to collect those and include those in their consideration as they move forward with the recommendation. Part of the engagement design team, as I mentioned, includes our arts and culture staff, and we have enlisted, or will be enlisting, the help of a graphic artist. As many of you noticed today, this report is very dense. It's complex work. It's important work, and we wanted to make sure that we have a way to speak to our stakeholders in a variety of methodologies. And we're thinking about infographics, about visuals, about different ways to present information. So we will be enlisting the help of a graphic artist to make that information more accessible. We will be working this month to be on, and we've actually already started, but we'll continue to work on things like frequently asked questions, just easy, digestible materials, because not everybody is going to read the voluminous report that was issued forward. And so we want to make sure that we are able to provide as much information in an accessible format as we will. And we're also cognizant that not everyone speaks English as their first language, and we want to make sure that we translate some materials, some critical materials, as we did with our municipal sick leave policy, in different languages or provide different forums. And so that'll be a consideration as we move forward. Lastly, I wanted to point out that we will also be including the Workplace Advisory Group. City Council approved a Workplace Advisory Group, and applications, I believe, are due at the end of next week. So we're hoping as soon as those applicants are named that we can start involving them in the process. But the consideration of our timeline takes into account having them be a participant in this as we move forward, being sensitive to the fact that they will also be engaging with the municipal sick leave policy. And so we have been conversing with civil rights to make sure that whatever overlap we may have, we can be considerate of their time as well as that moves forward. So before you is a very high-level timeline that really speaks to where we think we can be. As I mentioned, this month we'll really be developing communication materials and planning for outreach. We hope that through November and February, between November and February, we'll be holding those listening sessions and meetings. We believe that time frame, even though there are some holidays in there, will give us enough time to key into meetings that are already planned and to create some of our own in order to move forward. So through March and early May, we believe staff will be synthesizing that information, getting all the comments that we've received, getting all the summaries and all that feedback from the listening sessions so that we may present a recommendation by mid-May, as there is an interest to be able to move on something by the end of the second quarter. So our hope is to have a presentation mid-May. I did not put a date on that in awaiting for the calendar for 2017 to be approved for next year, but we will certainly be, that is our plan right now to be doing that. And throughout the whole process, we will have staff looking at peer city and additional research that's needed. And finally, wanted to just share with you the staff that's already been called, that's been called to action, if you will, some of which, particularly in CPED, they've already been deeply entrenched in this work, and some other folks that have been working on the communication side. But we'll be working with these folks and adding additional resources as necessary. Happy to stand for questions.
All right. I am not seeing questions. I do want to note, that this engagement plan was eagerly awaited as well, even though I think a lot more questions fielded to the study team. But I know there's been a lot of interest too in kind of what is the recommendation from the city coordinator's office that allows us to kind of start that formal process of engagement. And so I want to thank a very large team of staff that have been working and are continuing to give their talents and time in terms of energy and ideas and, the basic work that we need to do to make sure we're being transparent and doing all the other things that we know are important to moving this work forward. So with that, I'm going to move to receive and file the presentation. All in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That item is approved. And finally, we have reports of committees. I'll note it is 12:01, and I may just ask if there are significant items that committee chairs would like to mention to us, or however you'd like to handle it. And I'll first ask Councilmember Goodman with Community Development Regulatory Services.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The committee is bringing forward 14 items. I will note the most significant item is that we're moving into round 6 of Green Homes North, which is the last funded round right now of Green Homes North. There are 12 lots that are going to be sold by our action on Friday, resulting in 106 total lots completed under Green Homes North. I also just want to note, both in CD and also in Ways and Means, there are some changes to the Target Center Health Club lease modification, all to our benefit, as we move forward with working with the folks at Lifetime in order to continue the construction on Target Center and keep Lifetime open and in response. And thank you for their $22 million private investment in the building.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon with Health.
I just wanted to thank the committee for moving forward a small resolution that I had to establish recycling chute requirements for new construction, and note that I'll be bringing forward an amendment tomorrow just to encourage people to also look at organics. I'm working with Councilmember Linea Palmisano on that, and I can share more information between now and Friday with all of you.
All right, thank you. Next, public safety with Councilmember Yang.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I will pass.
Okay. Next, transportation, public works with Councilmember Wright. Any significant items?
We have 15 items. Thank you, Madam Chair. We have 15 items. I think all 15 items are consistent with the typical work of the department at this time.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Ways and Means. Councilmember Quincy had to leave. I'm the vice chair, and I'll just note we have 8 items coming forward. These were all consent items at the committee level. And last, zoning and planning with Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have 5 items. The 2 most significant is a variance appeal for the Alatis Tower at 200 Central Avenue Southeast, as well as approving a civic engagement calendar for the comprehensive plan update, which will kick off public engagement in October.
All right. So thank you to my colleagues. With that, we have concluded with our business, and we are adjourned. Thank you.